Hello everybody, this is Dr. Kevin Connors. In this presentation we're going to go over histamine. Um, for those who don't know anything about it, hopefully this will be helpful. For those who already know that they have a histamine issue, this will help explain it a little bit, that it's not a disease and it's not an allergy. You've heard it that it's a histamine sensitivity. Well, we're going to get into details of that in this presentation. So hopefully you'll get a lot out of this, so stick with me. So the first thing that we want to understand that is that histamine does a lot of really important things in our body. It helps us produce hydrochloric acid. It helps us kill things in an immune response. It functions as a neurotransmitter. It helps us get to sleep and stay asleep. It helps other hormonal functions in our body. It acts similar to an adaptogen in our body. It helps us keep memories in the brain. That's the neurotransmitter piece. Helps us wake up. We need histamine to stay awake. Histamine is a very important substance in our body. It's from a classification of organic substances called amines. So histamine is made by our body. It's made by mast cells in our body in the presence of an antigen, like an infection. Mast cells release histamine. It helps us kill that infection. It's an important factor in a lot of different cellular function. The thing is, it doesn't have a very long half-life in our body, so it shouldn't stay present in the tissues for a long period of time. So the question is histamine good or is histamine bad? Just like every other substance that is made in our body or that we absorb into our bloodstream, it's really not about whether it's good or bad. It's like you heard about cortisol. Well, too much cortisol can cause you to retain fat, and so cortisol is bad. Well, if you don't have cortisol in your body, you won't break down sugar stores and you won't be able to stay sleeping at night. And cortisol is not a bad guy. It's a hormone that's secreted during the stress response by your adrenal glands. Histamine is not a bad guy either. We tend to think when we have a histamine reaction or we have a histamine sensitivity that histamine is bad and we want to get rid of all histamine in our body. Well, that's just not really true. It's all about balance. That's just the way our body works. It's all about maintaining balance and keeping the right amounts of everything in our body. That's just like when we talk about the genetic picture. When I have a genetic defect, I don't create enough of something, or I don't make enough enzyme to break down something, and I can have excess one thing and too little of something else. It's all about trying to maintain that delicate balance. So we want to always classify something as good or bad, but that's just not really true. We need histamine. The problem is sometimes it's difficult to maintain that balance, and if this is what you feel like on that balance beam of histamine, then we can have some issues. So how do we get out of balance? How do we maintain that balance? So that's what this presentation is for. So let's talk about that. So we have to remember in maintaining that histamine balance that histamine is produced by an immune response. So if I have an excess immune response due to something, well, how could that be? Well, if I have chronic Lyme disease, or I have a hidden chronic H. pylori infection, or I have a hidden mold sensitivity because I have mold in my body, or some hidden parasite in my body. So I have this chronic, ramped up immune response in my body. I am going to be producing excess histamine. So some people say, oh, I have a histamine intolerance because I make too much histamine. Well, you better figure out why you make too much histamine. There's no imbalance that's genetic of you making too much histamine. The reason why a person would make too much histamine is that they have a chronic, usually subclinical infection, meaning that they don't know they even have this infection. For instance, we've talked a lot about H. pylori and heart disease. The first incidence of knowing the person has a chronic H. pylori infection is that they drop dead of a heart attack. And in a post-mortem study, that blood smear of that clot reveals an H. pylori infection. Well, we didn't even know they had that. Death can be the first indicator. But there's hints. One of the hints of a chronic infection is a histamine issue. So you can have histamine problems because of a ramped up immune response, number one. Doesn't have to be a ramped up immune response, as you'll find out in a second, but that is one reason why a person can have excess histamine and they find themselves out of balance. The second way that we get histamine in our body is through dietary sources. So a dietary source of histamine are basically aged foods. Cheese, aged cheese. The older the cheese it is, the more aged it is, the more histamine it's going to contain. Eggs contain histamine. So, again, how old the eggs are, how old the histamine is, how much histamine levels they're going to be. Nuts, all nuts contain histamine. Fermented, pickled foods, obviously those are aged. They contain a lot of histamine. Alcohol contains histamine. Aged meats, smoked meats contain histamine. Well, wait a second, you're going to say. Gosh, I thought fermented foods were really good for me. They have all sorts of probiotics in them. I've been making kombucha and water kefir. Now you're saying that that's not good for me? Time out a second there. So understand, histamine isn't a bad guy. There's nothing wrong with eating histamine. It's all about balance. So if I have a histamine issue, then we're going to talk about these foods. If a person doesn't have any issue with histamine, they can continue to eat these things. Now, obviously, you want to know if you have antibodies to dairy and you shouldn't be eating cheese, or if you have, candida and you shouldn't be eating fermented foods either. So there's all about balance. We tend to, in this society, think that, kombucha is good for you, so everybody should eat kombucha. Everybody should eat fermented foods. That's not what you're going to find always true. So we want to see where the balance is. So if a person has excess histamine levels, then you want to look at, number one, do they have a ramped up immune response for some reason, i.e., subclinical infection, or number two, are they eating too much dietary histamine, and there's going to be something else going on with that, like a leaky gut or a gene defect that we're going to talk about in a second, that's allowing these histamines to pass through and causing a ramped up histamine in the tissue. Remember, it's all about balance. So keeping that balance is the key. Even with a person with a high histamine level, it's not that they have to eliminate all these high histamine foods. They might want to cut down on them for a while to decrease the histamine in the body, and then they can still eat these. We're not talking about an allergy. So get that difference. We're talking about a gluten sensitivity. That's an allergy. You're having an immune reaction to that gluten. We're not talking about an immune reaction to histamine. We're talking about what histamine does to the tissues. And when we eat a lot of histamine foods with a leaky gut or with the inability to break down histamine, then those go into the tissue and we have an excess amount of histamine in the tissue. If you can think of a bucket, that's my best scenario. Think of a bucket. Okay, wrong bucket. We don't want to think of that bucket. Think of an empty bucket. So here's an empty bucket that is your tissues when we're talking about histamines. Now, all sorts of things go into that bucket. And when that bucket gets full and spills over, we have an issue. So when we eat foods go into that bucket and they have a lot of histamines in it. Well, we fill up that bucket. If we have a chronic infection and our mast cells are making a lot of histamine, we fill up that bucket. So even if I have a cold, oh my goodness, I have a cold. So my cold, I'm going to produce more histamine than if I didn't have a cold. If I have any common infection that might be going through for just a short period of time, I'm going to have excess histamines. If I have a histamine problem and I have a cold, maybe I should eat less histamine foods so that they don't spill over my bucket. Follow me? This is why people that have histamine issues go, I can't figure it out. I ate eggs 4 times this week and I didn't have any issues, so I was trying to figure out which food is causing my issues. What issues could histamine cause? Racing heart, bloating tummy, tummy aches, stomach problems, digestive issues, itching, rashes, eczema, rosacea type issues are all histamine issues. Foggy thinking, brain fog, anxiety, depression, emotional swings can be histamine issues. Stuffiness, nasal congestion can be histamine issues. So I'm trying to figure out, is it a food allergy? And it's just so confusing because I ate eggs 4 times this week, and then I ate eggs this morning, and I know right after I ate those eggs, I felt so cruddy, my stomach bloated up like I was pregnant, or whatever symptom is causing your thoughts to concern yourself with a possible food allergy. Understand, it's not a food allergy. It's the chemical histamine. It's this amine in this food that's filling up your bucket and finally tipping over, and now you have the symptoms of this excess histamine. Got it? So it's not an allergic reaction, it's just a bucket spilling over. So let's look at some of the genetic factors that predispose us to histamine issues. When we look at your genes, there's really 2 gene families that we want to look at with histamine issues. The ABP1 gene and the HNMT gene. These genes, or these families of genes, are the 2 most important things with the histamine issue. The ABP1 gene really makes the enzyme the DAO enzyme that breaks down histamine in the gut. The HNMT gene makes the DAO and the MAO enzyme that breaks down histamine in the tissue. So if in this case there's actually, I couldn't get all the family of the HNMT gene on here. This is what a 23andMe panel reads out. 5 of the ABP1 genes and about 20 of the HNMT genes. In this person's case scenario that I took the screenshot of, this is a person's gene profile, they have 2 single allele defects in the ABP1 gene. They're going to have a decreased production of DAO enzyme in the gut, and therefore any food that they eat that has histamine in it is not going to get broken down quite as well as if they didn't have those gene defects. You follow me? So this is a gene profile. The ABP1 is a gene, a family of genes that you see here. That 1 means that person has a single allele defect on 2 of those family genes. That family of genes, those ABP1 genes. Single allele defect is going to cause that gene to not quite work so well. So therefore, what does that gene do? That gene makes DAO enzyme that breaks down histamine in the gut. So they're not going to break down histamine quite as well as if they didn't have this defect. Therefore, they could absorb more histamine. Therefore, they could have an excess histamine in their body. Well, in this person's case scenario, it gets much worse because their HNMT gene, they have a double allele defect on just what I showed here. They actually had a worse picture than this, but they had a double allele defect on 4 of those 6 that I showed in this picture. Now that's really bad. So that gene is not working very well at all. So even if they get a common cold, they're going to have a ramped up histamine level. That's normal, right? So common cold is going to increase histamine production. That's normal, but normally histamine should have a very short half-life. Why? Because this wonderful HNMT family of genes should be making DAO and MAO enzyme that should be breaking down the histamine so that this person doesn't have any excess histamine. But in the case of this poor soul that has this gene defect, they don't make that very well at all. So in the tissues, they don't get rid of histamine. Well, that kind of stinks. So now they're going to have their bucket is going to fill up quite quickly. So even if they don't eat any histamine foods and they don't absorb any histamine foods from the gut, which is really relatively impossible, I'm just saying pretend, they're still, if they get a common cold, they're going to have a spill of histamine into the body. They just don't get rid of it very well, so they're going to be prone to problems with histamine. So from a genetic standpoint, these two genes make the enzymes that break down histamine in the gut and in the tissues. If you have defects in those two gene families, you are going to have problems with histamine. Well, it gets worse than that because there's another gene, the FUT2 gene, that makes the healthy slime layer for your microbiota to live in the gut. So your flora can live in the gut so that you have this healthy symbiotic called your microbiota, all these different bacteria and organisms that live symbiotically in your gut to help you absorb food, help you break down food, and they live off of you, and you live off of them. Now, FUT2 is a gene that helps make the apartment complex for them to live in. Now, this poor person has a double allele defect on the entire family of the FUT2 genes. They don't have any carpenters making the apartment complex for the gut flora to live. They're going to have a much damaged gut flora. So you heard of leaky gut syndrome. Well, leaky gut syndrome ties into that. So a person could have leaky gut syndrome because they took antibiotics for 3 months and now that killed all their flora and they have to take probiotics to regrow that flora. But if you add a FUT2 gene defect to it and they took antibiotics for 3 months and now they take probiotics now for the next 6 months to try to reheal their gut, that's the person that I can't figure out why my gut has still got such this problem. I know I shouldn't have taken those antibiotics for 3 months, but I've been taking probiotics for the last 2 years and they don't do anything. Well, let's look at your gene profile, and golly jeepers, you got a FUT2 gene defect. Well, you're not going to get better, period, unless we give you prebiotics and we do a bunch of other stuff to heal your gut. Still with me? So this histamine thing's a little bit more complicated than maybe you have been once led to believe. You have to look at the genes, the ABP1 and the HNMT and the FUT2 gene. It's very important because it really tells us a story on how we're going to fix this person. So this is why I'm so keen on doing your genetic testing. The immune response is going to ramp up my histamine release. It's going to fill up my bucket. Any chronic immune response, right? Or an acute immune response is going to fill up my bucket quickly. Dietary intake of excess histamines is going to fill up my bucket. Because even if I have a really healthy gut and no leaky gut, still lots of consumption of histamines. If I'm on a salami and cheese Gouda diet, I'm going to have a lot of histamines in my gut. So they're going to absorb. So even if I have a healthy gut, some are going to be absorbed and it is going to fill up my bucket. Well, if I have a healthy ABP1 and a HNMT gene, I'm making plenty of enzymes to break it down. It's no big deal. I'm not going to have a histamine problem. And that's the majority of people. So 70% of the population, maybe I just picked that out of the air, don't have a histamine problem because they don't have a gene defect and they can handle it just well. Then you add a leaky gut on top of that because this person was exposed to genetically modified organisms and they eat a typical American diet, or they haven't taken antibiotics or whatever, that damaged the gut, and a FUT2 gene defect, and now you got a chronically ill individual. Follow me? You add all these things up and it gives you the picture of this person having a histamine intolerance. So what do you do? That kind of stinks. Well, you're stuck. No, I'm just kidding. So there are some things you can do. So let's just think this through. Just think it through on everything that we talked about so far. Well, doesn't it make sense that we should work on healing the gut? Yeah. Well, we don't want to absorb, excess histamines, so maybe we should work on healing the gut. So that gets back to, healing the gut is a very important thing to do, no matter if you got cancer or Lyme or headaches or whatever you got. Healing the gut is really important. So how do you heal the gut? Well, you want to reduce inflammation of the gut from other sources too. So does this person have a gluten sensitivity? Do they have a dairy sensitivity? Do they have parasite infection? Is there something else, an H. pylori infection that we need to kill in the gut? Well, that talks about ramped up inflammation too, and ramped up immune system too, and increased mast cell production of histamines right there. But you don't want to deal with trying to heal the gut causing inflammation by eating gluten. When you have a gluten sensitivity, you're never going to heal the gut, right? Well, we already talked about eating less histamine foods, so less aged cheese, eggs, nuts, etc. I got a whole list of these things that we give our patients that have histamine issues. That, again, it's not that that's an allergy. It's that these are foods with high histamine, so it would be a good idea to reduce those for a period of time until we get your gut healed, until we get your bucket down a little bit. But I love I love pickles. Well, you can still eat pickles, but maybe don't eat quite so many, and maybe make sure you eat a lot of fiber with your pickles, and maybe you balance it out. Think of that bucket. We don't want it to overflow. Okay? How else do you heal the gut? Well, there's a bunch of different nutritional things you can take. I'm really big on prebiotics. If you don't have especially if you have the the FUT2 gene defect, you've got to use prebiotics or you are toast. These are the people that are on probiotics for 4 years and they say, I can't figure out how I can't heal my gut. Well, you're probably depositing the probiotics in the toilet every day because you don't have any place for them to live. So prebiotics help your gut cells make the apartment complexes for the probiotics to live, you could say. Also, helping with HCl and digestive enzymes and increasing your stomach acid production, etc. There's a whole bunch of things we want to do to heal the gut, and we have other presentations on that. But that's really important, and that's a good place to start. The other thing is reduce systemic inflammation. What's causing my increased mast cell production of histamine in the first place, right? Better look at that. Do I have a chronic infection that I don't even know about? Do I have H. pylori? Do I have Lyme disease? Do I have mold? Do I have some parasite of some kind that I don't even know about? How would I know that? There's labs you could do. There's testing you could do. We do that in our personal lab tests and our kinesiology testing of every patient. There's lots of ways to know that. Just because your doctor did a blood test and the blood test didn't show H. pylori does not mean you don't have H. pylori. It's not going to stay in the blood for very long. Okay, same thing with Lyme. I had a negative Lyme test. What'd you do? A blood test for Lyme. Did it test for antibodies? No. Well, then it was a pretty lousy test because Lyme isn't going to be circulating in your blood for very long or you're going to be dead. So you got to go to a doctor who knows something too. So look at my videos on all that stuff. This video is not on a chronic infection, but chronic infections are rampant. That's a cause of a lot of people's problems. So just know that. The other thing you could do is to use products that will help scavenge histamine out of your body. This first one, this Seeking Health product, is Histamine Block. That is actually the DAO enzyme, and there's a number of companies that make that and supply the DAO enzyme. I don't suggest using that a lot. First of all, the DAO enzyme does not absorb, so it's only going to stay in the gut. Well, that's okay, right? Because if I eat some cheese, then I take the DAO enzyme, then it'll break down and I won't absorb it. Yeah, that is okay, but it's kind of a pricey product. It's about $1 a pill. So I'd suggest that's not the way to go. Now, granted, if you want to splurge and you know your bucket's full, then you could take a few of those. All my patients with histamine issues, I have them buy a bottle of that, but then try to have them not use it, and you can use it in an emergency. If you know you're going to go out and have a lot of histamine foods and you were exposed a lot today, you're under a lot of stress increases it too, then you can take some of that. There's other histamine scavengers like Designs for Health Histes. We use a professional health product called Histamine Scavenger that works really well. I didn't have a picture of that. And you can use my famous stress reduction kit. Just start banging your head against the wall. That always helps. Maybe not. So remember that it's a bucket. That's the biggest thing I want you to get out of this, because I said that word probably 500 times. The more that you put in the bucket, the more symptoms you're going to have. You are not cursed to not be able to eat cheese, eggs, nuts, fermented foods, etc. the rest of your life. But the more you eat, the more you're going to put in that bucket and the more symptoms you're going to have. Many times it's good to just clean it out, figure out these problems, heal your gut, and then you can go back and experiment and see how much you can tolerate without having symptoms. Does that make sense? Again, if you're watching this, if you've never done the genetic test, go to my website there, the Connors Clinic website, go to the genetic tab, and you'll learn how you can run the genetic test on yourself. And even if you're not a patient, I'll still read the test for you and we can go over that. That's the best way to look at this. I think that's super important. Anybody that's been told that they have a histamine hypersensitivity and they're really working hard at staying away from histamine foods really should do the genetic test. It's not that expensive to find that out. That's what we do with all our patients because you really want to personalize their medicine. It just goes back to balance with everything, remember. Just because kombucha is really good does not mean it's really good for everybody. And just because histamine is not good for you because you have excess histamine does not mean histamine is bad. So you want to personalize your care and how you're going to treat your disease as best as possible too. I hope you learned something from this. Go back and watch it again if you need to, and enjoy some of the other videos on our site as well. Thank you. Have a great day.